Good morning again. As Logan said, my name is Tyler. I am excited to be with you this morning. Hopefully you had a good week. The MLB season wrapped up. We have a new World Series champion. The Dodgers are the champions. That's enough. As a Cubs fan, it was kind of like evil versus evil for me, the Yankees versus the Dodgers, but they did it. But one thing, the Dodgers have not even really debatable anymore, the best baseball player on the planet in Ohtani. He's a player that came over from Japan. They call him kind of like the next Babe Ruth. This guy hit over 50 home runs and stole over 50 bases. Never been done in the history of the sport. Also, he's coming off an injury, but he is a pitcher as well, which is stupid that they have that in a player, but he was a Cy Young contender, which is like a contender for the best pitcher in the league. He was Rookie of the Year when he came in. So he is just absolutely unbelievable. He's going to be a slam dunk for the Hall of Fame. It's going to be, no doubt, he's going to go into the Hall of Fame. Every sport has Hall of Fames. I don't know if you know that. Every sport has a Hall of Fame where they identify the best players in that league over the history of the sport. Even darts has a Hall of Fame. Do you know that? Yeah, I found out this week. Phil Taylor, a guy named Phil Taylor, is the best dart player of all time. Just boom, boom, locking in. So if you don't know that, Phil Taylor is the best dart player of all time. But every sport has a Hall of Fame. Did you know, though, that the Bible also has a Hall of Fame? Maybe you didn't know that. It's called the Hall of Fame of Faith. It's listed in Hebrews 11. It has a whole bunch of people from the Old Testament, and it lists them as, it's like identified as the Hall of Faith because these are all people that identified great acts of faith and faith in God through situations that they went through. And one of those people that's listed a couple times in the Bible's Hall of Fame of Faith is a guy named Abraham. In Hebrews 11, here we read this: by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promise was about to sacrifice the one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." So Abraham, maybe you grew up in Sunday school, you've sang this song about him. He's kind of like the father of our faith. He's known as Father Abraham. His name actually means father or the father of multitude. And that's because God, in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, made a covenant, which is a promise through him. And he said, through you, Abraham, through your offspring, I'm going to bring forth a great nation. And we see him listed here in this Hall of Fame of Faith in conjunction with this really crazy, wild story. The story of God testing him by asking him to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Now, we're in a series about the names of God, and last week, if you weren't here, we started by talking about the name Yahweh, which is the name that appears the most in the entire Bible for the names of God. It's over 6,000 times, and we talked about how it's the personal name of God. It's a God that gave his people the name that says, I am who I am. I'm the beginning and the end. I'm so great. I'm so almighty, but also I'm personal, and I want to be in a relationship with you. That even though I'm bigger than anything you could ever imagine, I also am small enough to be in every moment with you. And if you weren't here last week or you want to catch up, you could always go to YouTube and watch that. But today, we're going to be looking at another name that was given out of this situation in Abraham's life. The situation that got him into Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Fame of Faith. And it's a story that I've read, heard about, heard preached, heard taught dozens, if not hundreds of times as I grew up in the church. But this week, as I was reading it and studying it, it came alive for me in a way that I've never experienced. And I hope that it will for you as well. And I hope that God provides some insight to who he is through this story where he identifies his name as Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord provides. Let me pray, and then we're going to jump into our story for today. God, I'm grateful for your word and your truth. I'm grateful for you wanting to be in a personal relationship with us. God, I'm grateful that you identify yourself in ways that we can understand and comprehend. And God, I pray as we're working through the story and narrative today, you hit each and every person in this room and watching online in a really personal and profound way. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I'm actually going to start by reading through the entire story in Genesis 22, which typically I don't read through that much scripture, but it's so important for me to have you see the entire picture. And then I'm going to walk through and just break out some things that jumped out to me. So if you have a Bible, open it to Genesis 22. If you have the app, the Stateline app, we put all the scriptures on there, or it's going to be on the screens as well. So Genesis 22, starting in verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for a place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw a place off in the distance. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place that God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But an angel of the Lord called out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." He said, "Here I am." "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." So we see in this story, God asks Abraham to do this thing, this incredibly difficult thing, and Abraham obeys. And they journey up the mountain, and we see that God provides a way at the very last second for him to come through. And because of this, Abraham is taken aback, and he names this place, "On this mountain it will be provided." It's an incredible story. It's a crazy story. It's a powerful story. But there's no doubt that you're sitting there reading this. Maybe some of you for the very first time, you're like, this is a difficult story. What a tough story to read. The task that God gives Abraham to sacrifice his son, you read it and it doesn't feel good. It's not one of those feel-good stories. It doesn't feel loving. And for a lot of readers, it can oftentimes be kind of confusing. But when you unpack this story, as I've done this week, and look at it from a holistic context, it starts to reveal some things about God that are unbelievable. It starts to peek into the foresight that he has as the divine architect in a really profound and powerful way. And so what I would love to do is actually walk through this story and pull out a few things that just jumped out to me. And hopefully they're helpful to you as they were to me, and just to see some things about the story as it reveals a little bit more about God's heart. So again, the first 2 verses, sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you." So right away, we see God calling to Abraham. Now, what you have to understand here is, you don't see this from this story specifically, but if you go back in the book of Genesis, you know that Abraham lived a lot of life. Abraham had gone through a ton of really difficult situations, ups and downs. He spent over 100 years on this planet following God through those difficult situations, through those situations that maybe didn't make sense to him, through these different difficult seasons. Now, a quick side note, if you read Genesis, you might be aware of this, but Abraham's name wasn't Abraham forever, and Sarah's name wasn't Sarah forever. They were first named Abram and Sarai, and God renamed them in Genesis 17 to give them an indication of, hey, I'm still with you, I'm promising things through you, I'm changing your name to indicate the promise that will come. I'm still going to refer to them as Abraham and Sarah, even as I talk about some of the stories where they were named something different, just for confusion's sake. So, jumping back into the story, back into Genesis, God had made a promise to Abraham and his wife Sarah years before this moment that he was going to bring forth a nation through them, that he was going to give them offspring that would bring forth a nation. What you have to understand is, in this moment, though, Sarah was 65 years old. She had never conceived a child. She didn't think she could conceive a child. I think the term now is like advanced for maternal age. Like she was very advanced for maternal age. She's like, it's over, it's not gonna happen, I'm not gonna have a child. And God promises her when she's 65, it is gonna happen. I see you, I'm with you, I'm gonna bring forth a nation through you. And they got excited. Her and Abraham, they got excited. They started working on the baby room. They started decorating it. They're like, we're gonna have a baby. We're so excited. And a week later, it didn't happen. She didn't get pregnant. A month later, a year later. And they started to think, wait, is this actually the promise? Like, God, you promised something. Why isn't it happening right now in this time? He gives them this impossible, huge promise, and they were excited, but they started to get impatient. And Sarah got so impatient that she said, I need you to have a son, Abraham. Would you sleep with our servant Hagar to make that happen? And he does, and he sleeps with Hagar, and they have a child, him and Hagar, and his name is Ishmael. But this wasn't God's plan. This was their plan. This was them trying to move in their power to manufacture what they thought the blessing should be instead of waiting on God's plan and God's promise, trusting that God would provide. And so this kind of jumped out to me right away of like, have I ever been there? Have you ever been there? Understanding that God has good things planned for you, understanding that he's promised a life that will bring you closer to him, understanding that he is a good God, a loving God, a kind God that is for you and wants the best for you. Have you ever been there knowing that, but also then thinking, well, that's not happening exactly the way I'd hoped. That's not happening in the time that I had hoped. And so maybe we start to manufacture our own blessing. We start to force a relationship. We start to create our own success or develop a personal plan for joy and happiness. Maybe we choose quick avenues to pleasure or comfort and not wait on God and his eternal peace. We know that God has promises for us, but it's so hard sometimes to wait. And we see that in the life of Abraham and Sarah, as they knew God had promised something amazing, but they couldn't wait for his timing. This is exactly where they were. God's promise, as we know later, was Isaac, but Abraham and Sarah couldn't see that, so they forced it. But we do see, still, even though they did that, even though they forced it, even though they operated outside of God's plan, that 25 years later, God continues to say, this is still my promise. He continues to reiterate, the covenant I made with you, the promise I made for you is still true. And we see 25 years later that he and Sarah, Abraham and Sarah, conceived a son. But he says that they're going to conceive a son, and Abraham kind of laughs at him. He says, how is this going to happen? He says, Sarah's 90 years old. She was very advanced for maternal age. Now she's very, very, very advanced for maternal age. Like, God, I don't see how this is going to happen. Why didn't you do it 25 years ago? But we see at the age of 90 that Isaac was born to Sarah. The one that God had promised, the one that numerous descendants would eventually come from. And so the story that we're looking at today of Abraham taking Isaac up on a hill to sacrifice him, what God is asking Abraham to do is incredibly confusing to Abraham. It's confusing because he's saying, take your son who you love, take your son who I promised, take your son who all descendants would then come from, nations would be birthed out of, and I want you to sacrifice him. Incredibly confusing. But also confusing because child sacrifice wasn't foreign to Abraham. There were other people in this culture who worshiped pagan gods who would sacrifice children to these pagan gods. And it was something that people who worshiped the one true God would never do, that God never asked them to do. And so he's asking them to do something that's seemingly out of his character. Asking Abraham to do something that the pagan gods require that he has never required. And so first he's asking him to sacrifice a son who he loves, but also he's doing something that just seems like it's out of character for God. But we see that Abraham got up the next morning and he moved forward with what God asked him to do. Now, what's not written here, but I can only believe, is that was a very sleepless night. He lay awake maybe all night, maybe wrestling with God, maybe begging God, maybe saying, God, if this cup could pass, maybe there's a different way. And he probably was bargaining with God all night. I'm not saying that it was a peaceful sleep, but we do see for sure that the next morning, not a year later, not even a month later, the very next morning, Abraham gets up and starts following through with God's plan. And that jumped out to me right away. Because I feel like there's times in our life, in my life, where God asks me to do something and I drag my feet for so long trying to figure out, okay, is this really what you want me to do? Is this really the direction you're heading with me? Like, God, that doesn't feel like you. No, that must have been like I don't know, bad meal I had last night. I'm just feeling something weird. Like, that can't be you, God. And I drag my feet. And the very next morning, he moves into an impossible situation, making an impossible decision. It doesn't make sense on so many levels to me. But I start to think about Abraham. And I start to think about the things I said that led him up to this moment. Why would he instantly, after one restless night of sleep, say yes to God in this crazy thing that he's asking him to do? And I look back at Abraham's life, and all of the things that God had called him to do were difficult. Not as difficult as this, but God time and time again asked him to do difficult things and follow him and trust him. And Abraham continued to move into those situations and continued to trust God without knowing the outcome. And every time God continued to come through. We see in Genesis 12 that God asked Abraham to leave his home that he was comfortable with, that he knew. And Abraham didn't want to do it, but he decided to follow God. And God ended up giving him this new and better home. We see that God asked him to leave his family behind and move forward into the situation. We see that God blessed him with an even larger family. In Genesis 13, when God told Abraham to offer the best land to his nephew Lot, he could have thought like, no, that's my land. I don't want to offer the best land to him, but he did it and he followed through. And we see that God gave him even better land in the future. In Genesis 14, when God told Abraham to give up the King Solomon's reward that was promised to him, that would have been so lucrative, that would have changed his life, he said no because God told me not to, and God in turn ended up giving him even more wealth than he ever could have imagined. And when Abraham gave up his son Ishmael and sent him and Hagar away, the son who at that time was his only son who he loved, God preserved Ishmael. And he made him the father of a multitude as well because he was looking over him and he was blessing him. All throughout Abraham's life, God continued to call him and ask him to do these seemingly impossible and difficult and hard things. And every step of the way, God continued to walk with him and bless him and be with him and provide in ways that he never could have imagined. Abraham had been training for this moment on a mountain his entire life. I think a lot of times we read the story and he's in the Hall of Fame of Faith and we think, that's the moment when he got faith. That's not the moment when Abraham got faith. It wasn't the moment when his faith was formed. In fact, it was the moment when his faith was proven. On that mountain, everything led up to that moment saying, you have been forged by all of these small acts of obedience over decades and decades. You've been galvanized in faith in God. And this is why, not understanding it, he was able to get up the next morning and move forward into a situation that was the worst situation he had ever gone through up to that point. He didn't understand, but he still believed that God was good and that he was the author of his life. But more than that, he believed that he was the author of all life. And Abraham realized, as he'd realized up to this moment, that God's viewpoint was so much higher than his, that Abraham's vantage point couldn't understand what God was doing, the story that he was writing, the picture that he was painting, but he still trusted. He believed that God was good. And we see that he believed that God was good by one word in verse 5. It says this, he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. He's not confused. Abraham is not confused about the assignment. The assignment is to go and sacrifice Isaac. And so the way this should read, as he's saying this, is we will worship, and then I will come back to you. But he says, we will come back to you. Why does he say we will come back to you? Because if he follows through with the assignment, two people go up and one person goes down. That's an I statement, not a we statement. Why does he say we? In Hebrews 11:19, continuing on in the Hall of Fame of Faith, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Abraham did not know how this was going to play out. There would be no way for him to know how it was going to play out, but he was simply trusting God. He believed that the promises that God had made to him and through him in Isaac to be the one that generations would come from would never change. That when God makes a promise, when God makes a covenant, he doesn't go back on that promise. And so Abraham knew that that promise was true, that from Isaac a generation would come. And he didn't know how, but he believed that if he went through this, I don't know the outcome, but if I do it, even God can raise him from the dead, and this promise will continue to be true. He knew that God's plan is always bigger than our plan. And so Abraham draws from the past. He draws from a situation. He takes his faith that's been galvanized and he moves forward. And with every situation, he looks back on remembering, I didn't understand how I was going to get here, but God brought me through. I didn't understand how God was going to provide then, but he provided. And it starts to galvanize his faith as he moves forward. He understands that God is always 100% of the time with me and for me. Maybe it's not always going to happen the way he had hoped for. Probably not. Usually it's going to happen the way that he hoped for, but he always comes out on the other side understanding God 100% was with me, and this is better than I could have ever expected. And so Abraham journeys on up the mountain with Isaac by his side. And step by step, they move closer to the task, closer to the sacrifice. The altar's made. Isaac is bound up. And just as Abraham reaches for the knife, the angel of the Lord calls down and stops him. Abraham, stop! Don't lay a hand on the boy. Verse 13, Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide, and to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. When Abraham didn't understand, when he didn't see the end of the plan, he trusted. And in the final seconds, God came through, providing in a way that wasn't expected for Abraham. He provided a way when there wasn't a way, and Abraham then called that place Yahweh Jireh, or as we know it now, Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. God had a view of that mountain, and he had a view of Abraham's life, and he had a view of eternity that Abraham didn't. What we have to understand about this story is that God never intended to have Abraham kill Isaac. God always knew that he was going to provide a way out, a sacrifice in his place, because God's view was so much more infinite and higher and elevated. Charles Spurgeon says this, God is too good to be unkind, and he is too wise to be mistaken. And when we cannot trace his hand, we must trust his heart. When we don't understand what's happening, when we don't understand the steps that God is calling us to take, we can trust, though, that his heart is still good, that he is still kind, that he is for us, that he wants the best for us. All we can do in the darkness is trust that eventually the light will come, like it has before. Maybe this morning you just need to be reminded to think back to situations in your life where you didn't know how you were going to get through it, but you got through it, where God did provide. Where you need to call back to those situations to say, okay, what I'm going through now is really difficult, but God, you continued time and time again to bring me through difficult situations that led me to this difficult situation that I'm in currently. As Abraham was able to draw back from situation to situation, we can do that as well, no matter what we're going through, to think back, God, you have provided. You have been with me. You have been good. I didn't always understand it, but you were always with me step by step. So quick detour, quick story real quick because it's fall. I don't know how many of you like to go to the apple orchard. We like to go to Edward's Apple Orchard. Yep, a couple hands went up there. I wasn't looking for that, but that's great. We love to go. We love to go spend $300 or $400 on just not very much stuff. You get there, and it's kind of like Price is Right. You're like, how much do you think this jar of salsa is? You're like, I don't know, $4? We're like, no, $40. You're like, $40? What's it made of, gold? But yeah, we just go there and just blow through a whole bunch of money. But we also like to go to a place called Jonemak Orchard. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's kind of near DeKalb. If you have kids, it's phenomenal. It's great. We love going to Jonemak. We go there once or twice a year. But they've got great things for the kids. But they also have a corn maze, which I don't know if you've ever done a corn maze. But you get inside the corn maze, and then all of a sudden, all you can see is corn. You have no idea what's going on. You walk in there, and to your left is corn, to your right is corn, in front of you is corn. You look behind you, guess what there is? Corn, exactly. There's just corn everywhere. You're so disoriented, you don't know where to go. It's very confusing. You're trying to get out. Kids start to panic. You start to panic. It's a wild, wild ride. Now, this maze at Jonemak Orchard has two places where you can climb up about 8 to 10 feet above the ground so you can see above the corn. And you start to get a view from there, though. You're like, okay, it's not just corn. I can kind of see the edges. I can see down a couple rows. I can see other people even walking around. You start to get like some hope. You're like, okay, it's not just corn all over the world for all of eternity. There's actually maybe a way out of this. And you start to see a different picture. But it's not until you get hundreds of feet in the air that you actually get the whole picture of the corn maze. And here's a picture of Jonah Mac Orchard a couple years ago. It's beautiful. It's amazing. But when you're standing in the middle of it, all you see is corn, 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 corn. You don't get that picture. Even when you get a little bit above the corn, you don't get that entire picture. But I started thinking about this idea of being stuck in a corn maze and not knowing where you're going and feeling a little bit hopeless and scared at times. This is the picture that God has. When you get this high, you can see the entrance, you can see the exit, you can see the two places where you stand up higher, you can see all of the dead ends. But more than that, you can see the beautiful picture that's painted with all of it when it all comes together. This was true of Abraham on the mountain. God could see a picture that was different than what Abraham could see. God provides in ways that we don't expect, but this story is more than a guy a few thousand years ago who found a ram in a bush. When I read that story, that's kind of like the 8 to 10 foot view. You can see a little bit, you start to get some hope, but what if this story isn't just about one man following God and having a personal experience, but what if this is about another man centuries later who would change the course of eternity? This story that God is actually painting is a picture of things to come, of ways that he would provide down the road, not just for one person at a specific time, but for all people until the very end of time. Having God's viewpoint that we have now, we know that God was, first of all, never going to let Abraham sacrifice his son Isaac, but he's showing us of what a picture would look like of what he's going to eventually do through his son, Jesus. That eventually he would send his son to die in our place on a cross. And if you read the Bible with the understanding that everything, Old Testament and New Testament, is all pointing towards Jesus, it starts to unlock it and reveal things in a way that maybe you've never experienced before. And this story is no different. And so what I would love to do is go through this story quickly and show you the little things that point towards our Savior Jesus over and over again in this story. And in Genesis 2, it says, and God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love. Again, we knew there was an Ishmael, but God had asked him to send Ishmael away at this moment, or in the past. And so at this moment, his only son is Isaac, and he's referring to the son in which the promise was through. He says, take your son, your only son, whom you love Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. We know that when Jesus is getting baptized, God calls down from heaven and said, this is my son whom I love, the same language. We know in John 3:16 it said, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life, the same language as Isaac and Jesus. Verses 3 through 4, early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. We know that Jesus rode in on the last week on a donkey. And he took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. We know that Jesus was crucified between 2 men. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he sent out for a place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. As Jesus predicted and fulfilled, on the 3rd day, he would rise from the dead. In verse 6, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. He placed the wood, the tree, on Isaac as he walked up the mountain, and we know that Jesus carried the tree, the cross, up the mountain. In John 19:17, carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is known Golgotha. Isaac carried the wood for his sacrifice as Jesus carried the wood for his sacrifice. Verses 7 through 9. Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Father, yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place that God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it, bound his son Isaac, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. So if you've ever seen this story in Sunday school, which, why are we doing this story in Sunday school? I don't know. But they always depict Isaac as like an 8-year-old, right? What you have to understand is Abraham was over 100 years old, and his son Isaac was probably more likely in his early 20s. He was in his prime. So we have this fit young man in his prime and this dad that's old as dirt, weak as all get up, can't do anything. You're trying to tell me that this old man's going to bind up this young fit son? There's no way. And not only that, he wasn't a moron. Isaac was smart. And so Isaac even starts to understand here. He says, well, wait a minute, like, where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And it's starting to click for him. Starting to realize, wait a minute, am I the sacrifice? Am I the lamb? And at this moment, it would have made sense for him to sprint away faster than Abraham could ever sprint, run down and say to the other two people, hey, my dad's nuts. He's trying to kill me. But he didn't do any of that, did he? It says they continued on together. Because Isaac was submissive to his father and willingly walked up to be a sacrifice. And we know that Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing what was going to happen, he begged with God. He said, God, if this cup can pass, let it pass. But what did he say after that? He said, but your will be done. I know what's going to happen to me, and it's going to hurt, and I'm not going to like it. And so, God, if there's a different way, let that happen. But God, I'm going to be submissive to you and walk this journey and walk up the mountain to be a sacrifice, as we see Isaac do in this narrative. Genesis 22, 10 through 11. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Greg talked about this a few weeks ago when he talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But anytime it says the angel of the Lord, most theologians believe that that is, especially when that angel of the Lord speaks as if they are God, that it's what's called a Christophany, or it's the appearance of the pre-incarnate Jesus. Meaning Jesus, who has always been, even before he was a baby on Christmas, has always been with God in heaven. This is an indication of before Jesus came on Christmas that he appeared to people. And we see here such a beautiful thing, and only way that God could orchestrate, that Jesus stops him from killing Isaac. Almost as if he's saying, like, you don't need to do that because eventually I'm going to do that. Verses 13 and 14, Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket, he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on that mountain the Lord will provide. In the land of Moriah, on that mountain, the Lord will provide. And I love how it's said here in futuristic terms. It's a future tense indicated here, saying that what happened here is not going to be the end. In fact, I'm going to do something even better in the future. I'm going to provide in a way that you never could understand right now, right here in this place, on this mountain. And we see that to be true 1,000 years later. We see David build an altar to the Lord in that very same place. And after he had passed, his son, King Solomon, built a magnificent temple in that exact same place, a place where people could come and sacrifice and worship to God in that same place. We see that the temple was destroyed 70 years later, but then it was rebuilt in the same spot as the Jewish people returned from captivity. And then years later, we see King Herod add on to the temple that was already there, and we see that he would make it even more magnificent. But this was the place in Herod's temple where Jesus, when he was here on this earth, would come and he would teach and he would heal people. It's the place where Jesus went in and drove people out with a whip, the money changers. It's a place where we see so many times that Jesus intersected people's lives in a really powerful way. And here's where it all comes together. Exactly this same place in the land of Moriah is where Jesus would be hung on a cross, where the temple veil would be torn literally, but also figuratively, dividing a way for us to be back with our Father through the final sacrifice of Jesus. That's the beauty of God's story, is that God doesn't only have a higher view, he has a view that stretches to both ends of eternity. That when Isaac was walking up with his dad, he was signifying a Savior that would go to the cross for the final sacrifice for yours and my sins. God will provide. He does provide. And you have to look no further than Jesus on the cross to understand that. And when we're going through situations, when we're wondering if God's going to show up, when we don't like the timing, we can look to Jesus and say, God, you did provide. You provided a way for me to be in eternity with you forever, and that's enough. The crucifixion is enough. His sacrifice is enough. His blood that was shed is enough. And that was foretold through the story of Abraham and Isaac. in a way that blows my mind when I see it all unfold in the very same place on this planet. And we're free because of that. We're saved, we're redeemed because of that, and that is enough. So what we're going to do now is we're going to stand and we're going to sing to that God. We're going to worship that God. We're going to sing to Jireh this morning. Let's sing.